Meanwhile, the countdown has started for the launch in 2 days' time of the American Space Shuttle Challenger. Our space editor, Reg Turnell, is at Kennedy Space Center for the 7th shuttle mission, and he reports on the growing rivalry between Ariane and the Space Shuttle.
If Ariane's launch hadn't been successful today, Europe's rocket would probably have been scrapped. So there's great relief among the 11 European countries who've spent £1 billion developing it. Now Ariane will give America's shuttle some tough competition. It's due to launch 10 satellites next year, 5 of them American, and that's £100 million worth of orders the shuttle badly wanted. And of course, Dr. Sally Ride will become America's first woman astronaut when the shuttle starts its 7th flight on Saturday. Commander Bob Crippen in the center will be the first to make 2 shuttle flights. Sally, seen here passing instructions to shuttle crews on earlier missions, is 32, the youngest ever American astronaut. But it's 20 years ago today that Russia sent up her first woman, who was then only 26. Sally does lots of jet flying, though she isn't a pilot. She'll have the exciting job of using the robot arm to launch a satellite and 10 hours later grab it back again.
I am proud of what I'm going to do. I think that maybe excited is a better way to describe it, though. I'm very excited about the chance that I've got.
And Space Shuttle Challenger is due to end the mission by making the first ever landing back here at the Cape Canaveral launch site. If the weather's bad, it may wait an extra 2 days in orbit while it clears.
To 2 failures in 5 launches, all eyes were on the rocket. If it failed again, Europe would miss out on the profitable business of putting satellites into orbit. But today's launch was perfect, dead on time at 1 minute to 1. The rocket carried a European communication satellite designed by British Aerospace to beam TV pictures across Europe, and a smaller satellite that will relay messages between radio hams. Officials from the European Space Agency were delighted by the launch. American astronauts arrived at Cape Canaveral for the launch of the Space Shuttle on Saturday. Among them was Sally Ride, the first American woman in space. An astrophysicist by training, she'll be part of the first crew of 5 to fly in a shuttle. Lloyds of London have denied they've ever been in negotiation with the kidnappers of Shergar.
It's thought that about 250 commercial satellites will be going up into space over the next decade, and Ariane will compete directly with America's Space Shuttle for the chance of launching them. But a launch on Ariane will cost more than the shuttle. Ariane is less flexible than the shuttle, and, on the evidence so far, Ariane is less reliable. 2 out of Ariane's 6 test launches have failed. All 6 of the shuttles have succeeded. Kenneth Baker is Minister of Technology. Mr. Baker, has Europe landed itself with yet another industrial white elephant?
No. It was a great success today. The launch was one of a series, as you quite rightly said. You said there have been 2 failures, but in the early days of American space industry, they had lots of failures on the Delta rockets and the other rockets. It's a great day for European technology. We must have a capacity in Europe to launch satellites, and we've proved that we can do it.
But why should companies choose the European system rather than the more advanced American
Well,
one?
first, you said it's going to be cheaper, more expensive. In fact, it's likely to be cheaper. And if there was not a European satellite launcher, then the Americans could charge what they liked for the launches from the shuttle, and that would be no good at all.
So are we just in the market to keep down prices?
No, we're in the market to launch satellites. And Britain has a very good space industry. We're building 10 satellites at the moment. Some 4,000 engineers are employed in the space industry in Britain. It's a success for Britain. And you said 250 over the next decade. I want Britain to have a big share of that 250. And this is why we are supporting the space industry.
But isn't the launcher going to be operated by a French company? Is Britain going to see much of this money back?
Well, it's cooperative. You see, the French have specialised on the launcher. The Germans broadly specialise on space research. And we specialise on communication satellites, the things that are thrown up. And the one that's been launched today, by the way, is within 100 yards of its positioning in the atmosphere, which is remarkable, really. And we want to sell, in the course of the next 10 to 15 years, lots of communication satellites right across the world. This is why we're building the largest satellite in the world at the moment, called the LSAT, which is about half the size of a London double-decker bus.
But you say we specialise in satellites.
Right.
How can you be sure we're going to get a major share of that market?
Well, the satellite that was launched today, the communications one, which was made by British Aerospace here in Britain. And we're making 10. We're getting more business all the time. And they're made here in North London, in fact, and down in Portsmouth. We have got an expertise that is now recognised around the world in this technology. We're second to America in making satellites.
Why didn't we have a bigger part in the launcher programme?
Well, it's a shared programme. The French, as I say, concentrate upon the launcher, we concentrate upon the satellites. It's one of the great examples of how successful European cooperation is.
How much money did we put into the launcher?
We put about $16 million. Quite a lot of money for a very small part.
Yes,
but it was our satellite. If the launcher hadn't worked today, it was our satellite that would have been lost, and that's about 40 or 50 million pounds.
Makes sugar sound quite cheap. Looking further ahead, say 10 years from now, what size do you think the satellite business, of which you have such hope for Britain's, in financial terms, what would it mean to Britain?
We're making 10 at the moment, which is worth about £200 million a year. I would hope to see that going to 15 or 20 in the course of the next 5 or 6 years.
And in comparison, America?
America is making about twice the number that we're making at the moment. But we're beginning to do deals with American companies because they recognise our capabilities here. And the LSAT that I mentioned, that's the one that we really want to be the main satellite bus in the 1990s. That's going to be the biggest and most powerful satellite that has yet been made. And we're launching it in 1986.
Kenneth Baker, thank you very much indeed. Well, over the next few days, the spotlight is going to be on two women making their mark in very different ways. On Saturday, Sally Ride will become America's first woman in space when she blasts off aboard the Shuttle Challenger. And on Monday, Wimbledon starts with a great deal of attention focused on Joe Dury, who, despite a thrashing at the hands of Martina Navratilova at Eastbourne today, is still widely tipped as the woman who'll restore English tennis to its former greatness. We have reports on both women. First, from America, Andrew Mandelstam on the first American woman astronaut.
1977, Sally Ride, then a 25-year-old student in astrophysics at a Californian university, is amongst 5 females chosen as potential astronaut material. She was selected from a group of 1,000 applicants who replied to a newspaper advertisement placed by the space agency.
When I was growing up, when I was in junior high and high school and even in college, I really didn't think about flying at all. I had no background in flying. I had never been in a light airplane, and it was really a world that I hadn't been exposed to at all.
It took 5 long years and an estimated £75 million to prepare America's First Lady astronaut for her orbital mission. She underwent identical training to the 4 other members of the shuttle crew. But she claims that although it was challenging, she never even considered abandoning the project, nor did the space agency have any doubts that they'd chosen the right woman.
I think that once NASA made the decision that they were going to bring women astronauts into the program, they made that decision and stuck by it, and NASA was well prepared for us when we came, I think, for the most part. They treated us the same as they did the men. Our training has been no different, either in the physical side of it or in the actual assignments that were given, the tasks that were assigned, the flight assignments. I really don't think there's been any distinction between the women astronauts and the men astronauts. So from that point of view, it really hasn't been hard at all.
Sally Ride, the product of a well-to-do family, is like all astronauts keen on sport. An ardent amateur tennis player, Billie Jean King saw her participate in a tournament in 1972 and suggested she train to become a professional. She didn't heed the advice because she wanted to be second to none in the game, and she didn't think she could make it. Sally Ride has brought the same determination to succeed to the 7th mission of the Space Shuttle, but she shuns the publicity which surrounds the flight, even though at the pre-launch news conference she agreed to sit in the center of the rostrum, a position normally reserved for the crew's commander.
I think that it's maybe too bad that our society isn't further along and that this is such a big deal. But I guess if the American public thinks that it's a big deal, then it's probably good that it's getting the coverage that it's getting. I think it's time that we get away from that, and it's time that people realize that women in this country can do any job that they want to do.
Sally Ride's principal task on board the shuttle will be to control the Canadian-built manipulator arm, which for the first time will launch and then retrieve a satellite, bringing it back to Earth. 32-year-old Ride, who's married to another NASA astronaut, but admits to being an indifferent housewife, will not be called upon to actually pilot the shuttle. The nearest you will come to that is during the final approach phase. The Challenger will be landing for the first time back on a runway at Cape Canaveral, just a few miles from where it was launched. The last mission ended in California. Sally, whose sister is a Protestant minister, dismisses suggestions that she's attracted by the death-defying prospects of the flight.
No, I don't think so. No, I think the way that I look at it is it's really the experience of a lifetime. And death-defying isn't the reason that I'm doing it. I'm doing it because I think it's going to be a lot of fun.
Carrying America's first lady astronaut into space has led to one modification on board the shuttle. The Challenger's cabin is now equipped with a pink and white striped plastic curtain to be drawn when Sally Ride needs to fulfill some of her more personal tasks. Andrew Mandelstam, ITN, at NASA headquarters.
Built to rival America's space shuttle. It was a perfect launch from the French test center at Kourou in South America after earlier flights had ended in failure. The aim this time was to put 2 satellites, one of them British-built, into orbit. As Christopher Wayne explains, the future of the European space program depended on the mission.
With 2 of the previous 5 attempts ending in expensive failures, it was vital to demonstrate to customers that Ariane can put satellites safely into orbit. Today, it all went perfectly. French TV stations took these pictures live from Kourou in French Guiana. Their quality was poor, but one direct result of today's launch will be improved telephone links throughout Europe and better television pictures. Because mounted on the upper stage of Ariane was ECS-1, the £20 million European communications satellite built at Stevenage for the European Space Agency by British Aerospace. The first of 5 similar satellites, it can handle up to 9 TV channels or 15,500 simultaneous international phone calls. British satellite technology is now some of the most advanced in the world. Besides ECS, the Stevenage factory is building others for the Ministry of Defence and another for use by the BBC and ITV.
The ECS weighs just over a ton, and when these solar panels are extended, it measures 42 feet from tip to tip. Now that's pretty big, but it's dwarfed by comparison with this one. This 3.5-ton, 90-foot monster is Olympus, the biggest and most powerful commercial satellite so far planned. It's designed to carry 10 direct broadcast TV channels and up to 100,000 telephone calls. And if all goes well, it'll be launched into space on top of Ariane in 1986.
The importance of today's launch was that it's put the Europeans firmly back in the commercial space business. For British Aerospace, it's important because a European rival to the American Space Shuttle means all satellite launch prices have to be kept low, and in the long run, that's certain to mean more customers for Stevenage.
Good afternoon. America's Space Shuttle Challenger blasted off from Cape Canaveral about 25 minutes ago, and so far all is going well. It's a 6-day mission which will put America's first space woman into orbit. Sally Ride and her 4 male astronaut colleagues began boarding the shuttle 4 hours before liftoff. She's 32 and married to another member of the American astronaut team. More than 20 scientific experiments will be carried out during the flight, and 2 communication satellites will be launched from the shuttlecraft. On the launch pad this morning's countdown went smoothly, and blastoff was perfect.
We go for main engine start. We have main engine start, and ignition, and liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger your roll, Challenger. Houston now controlling. Mission control confirms roll maneuver started. Ground com on all hands channels 217 20 seconds. Rust looks good. 25 seconds. Roll maneuver completed. Now coming into the last traces of the Earth's atmosphere. Challenger now 19 nautical miles in altitude. 1 minute 55 seconds. Challenger 21 nautical miles in altitude, 21 nautical miles downrange. Standing by now for solid rocket booster separation.
2 minutes into the flight came the separation of the booster rocket from the spacecraft. Challenger was on its way into orbit.
12 minutes 12 seconds. Confirmed good solid rocket boosters.
America has also fired its new controversial missile, the MX. The test launch was delayed because of bad weather, but the liftoff was perfect as the unarmed MX began its 4,000-mile journey over the Pacific Ocean to a landing site in an isolated part of the South Pacific.
The Common Market Summit in Stuttgart is still deadlocked over Britain's demand for money back. America's just put its first woman into space. Astronaut Sally Ride went up with 4 other crew members in Space Shuttle Challenger.
It has been a perfect routine countdown to this 7th shuttle flight, a flight which will set several firsts, not just America's first woman astronaut to go into space, but also the largest number of astronauts to go up in one vehicle, 5 in all. Sally Ride's job will be to use the mechanical arm to put a satellite into space, then after several hours to pluck it back again.
We go for main engine start. We have main engine start and ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger your roll, Challenger. 40 seconds.
During its 6-day flight, the shuttle will launch 2 communication satellites before landing on a narrow runway just a few miles from where it took off. John Suchet, ITN, in Washington.
America has put its first woman into space. Astronaut Sally Ride went up with 4 other crew members in the Space Shuttle Challenger.
It had been a perfect countdown to what was to be a perfect launch. The crew had their traditional breakfast this morning, 5 of them, more than ever before, and of course Sally Ride, America's first woman astronaut, whose job it will be to operate the shuttle's mechanical arm, to put a satellite into space, then several hours later to pluck it back again.
We go for main engine start. We have main engine start and ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger your roll, Challenger. 40 seconds. The Challenger now still ahead.
During its 6-day flight, the shuttle will put 2 communications satellites permanently into space, and then will land again on a narrow runway just a few miles from where it took off.
Roger, sir.
John Suchet, ITN, in Washington.
Challenger is now safely in orbit around the Earth after a flawless takeoff from Cape Canaveral. And among the crew on the 6-day mission is America's first space woman. James Wilkinson reports.
She seemed cheerful enough. Sally Ride, 32 and a physicist, showed no sign of nerves as she prepared to make history. The first American woman astronaut to go into space. This time the shuttle has a crew of 5, including a doctor, to monitor motion sickness. Sally brought a female touch to preparations for the journey. The countdown had been smooth and the weather nearly perfect for the launch.
8, 7, 6. We go for main engine start. We have main engine start and ignition and liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
The liftoff was dazzling. It's the 7th shuttle launch, but the sight and sound of the vehicle as it disappears into the sky still thrills the watching crowds.
20 seconds. That looks good. 25 seconds. Roll maneuver completed.
It's a 6-day mission. Challenger will launch 2 commercial satellites, and Sally Ride will maneuver the remote-controlled arm to deploy and retrieve an experimental package.
1 minute 55 seconds. Challenger 21 nautical miles in altitude. 21 nautical miles.
2 minutes into the flight, with the shuttle on the edge of space, the 2 solid rocket boosters break away to parachute back to Earth.
Roger, set. 12 minutes 12.
First spacewoman is in orbit. Sally Ride blasted into space with 4 other astronauts in the Space Shuttle Challenger and said it was better than any ride at a fun fair. Mission Control say things are going well and the crew's performance is spectacular.
It had been a perfect countdown to what was to be a perfect launch. The crew had their traditional breakfast this morning, 5 of them this time, more than ever before, and of course, Sally Ride, America's first woman astronaut, whose job it will be to operate the shuttle's mechanical arm, to put a satellite into space, and then several hours later, to pluck it back again.
we go for main engine start. We have main engine start, and ignition, and liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger your roll, Challenger. 40 seconds.
A successful launch has become almost routine, but each time the space agency seems to provide more and more impressive pictures. This time, as Challenger reached the outer edge of the Earth's atmosphere, we were given the closest look yet at the jettisoning of the two solid rocket boosters. And soon after that, the onboard cameras were already showing us the payload area from where the shuttle will put two satellites into space. John Suchet, ITN, in the United States.
Than 10 hours into its 6-day mission. Among the crew of 5 is America's first woman astronaut. Sally Ride is 32 and a physicist. She's responsible for the shuttle's first major task tonight, the release of a communications satellite. The countdown this morning went smoothly, and the weather was nearly perfect for the launch.
6, we go for main engine start. We have main engine start, and ignition, and liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Challenger is now orbiting the Earth once every 90 minutes. During the flight, 20 scientific experiments will be carried out. The alliance leaders have ruled out any merger of their parties, at least for the foreseeable future. There had been a call earlier in the day from...
Challenger has now put 2 communication satellites in orbit, one for Canada, the other for Indonesia. Sally Ride, America's first woman astronaut, launched and filmed the first satellite.
What we're doing right now, Rick, is rewinding the VTR and setting it up for the beginning of the sequence.
Both launches went perfectly. First, the covers on the payload bay were opened up. Then the satellite was spun up to the bay and released into space.
And here she goes.
Let's shift over to the Delta camera, and you can see the KU band antenna there very briefly.
The 5 astronauts on Challenger have now started a 4-day program of space experiments.
Have now launched 2 communication satellites into orbit. America's first woman in space, Sally Ride, played back a video recording of the first launch. That was of a Canadian satellite.
What we're doing right now, Rick, is rewinding the VTR and setting it up for the beginning of the sequence. And you ought to be seeing pretty soon is the start of mechanical sequence, and you can see the sun shield opening up on the Anik. You saw a little bit of the jump there that we saw yesterday.
We saw that. And here she goes.
The drum-shaped orbiter popped out of Challenger's hold, spinning like a top for stability. The crew have now launched a second one for Indonesia. After all the activity, arrest and medical checkups, all smiles for the world's first floating stethoscope. The Prince and Princess of Wales braved the Canadian fog today and took to a barge to get to church. A naval officer kept a close eye on their timekeeping.
His first woman astronaut was launched into space on board the shuttle Challenger. Dr. Sally Ride, who's 32, is the 3rd woman into orbit, following 2 Russians. 5 astronauts on the mission, but it's Sally Ride who's in the public eye.
T-minus 10, 9, 8, 7, 6. We go for main engine start. We have main engine start, and ignition, and liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
Roger your roll, Challenger. Houston now controlling. Mission control confirms roll maneuver started. Ground time on all hands channels 21728. 20 seconds. Russ looks good. 25 seconds. Roll maneuver completed. 30 seconds. Challenger now 1 nautical mile in altitude. Throttling engines down now to 75% as programmed.
In the coming weeks, CFAX will be subtitling the following programmes. Tonight there's Yes Minister on BBC One, and later on BBC Two there's...
Challenger has now put 2 communication satellites in orbit, one for Canada, the other for Indonesia. Sally Ride, America's first woman astronaut, launched and filmed the first satellite.
Rick is rewinding the VTR and setting it up for the beginning of the sequence.
Both launches went perfectly. First, the covers on the payload bay were opened up, then the satellite was spun up to the bay and released into space.
And here she goes.
Let's shift over to the Delta camera and you can see the KU band antenna there very briefly.
The 5 astronauts on Challenger have now started a 4-day program of space experiments. 2 communication satellites in orbit, one for Canada, the other for Indonesia. America's first woman astronaut, Sally Ride, was in charge of the first launching. It went perfectly.
Which is behind the open annex sun shield start to open. And there it goes now, you can see it.
Looks good and smooth. No problems at all.
And show you the last part of mechanical sequence. Let you see the spin up.
Stop with the deploy. That's real pretty. That's my first view of it. Beautiful. We deliver. Okay.
We got it.
Ground control at Houston say they're pleased with how the mission has gone so far and with the way the crew dealt with minor equipment problems. With the satellites launched, Sally Ride and her 4 colleagues are now starting a 4-day program of experiments in different types of science.
Astronaut Sally Ride had time to play around with a video camera before telling Mission Control she was going to show them video pictures of the shuttle launching the Canadian satellite.
What we're doing right now, Rick is rewinding the VTR and setting it up for the beginning of the sequence. And you ought to be seeing pretty soon is the start of mechanical sequence, and you can see the sun shield opening up on the annex. Saw a little bit of the jump there that we saw yesterday.
We saw that. And here she goes.
The Canadian communications satellite was the first of 2 to be launched on this mission, fulfilling NASA's description of the shuttle as a delivery truck in space. The second satellite was for Indonesia to improve telephone links between the thousands of islands that make up Indonesia.
And that's real pretty. That's my first view of it.
So far, both the delivery truck and its drivers are doing well. John Suchet, ITN, in the United States.
Ghana's leader, Flight Lieutenant Jerry
Far. The astronauts are preparing for their biggest test, 2 days of experiments with the shuttle's mechanical arm. Christopher Wayne has been watching their progress.
On the 3rd day of the mission, the astronauts have been busy with some of the 11 experimental packages aboard Challenger. These getaway specials include one for processing glass, alloys and crystals in almost gravity-free conditions. It could lead to a breakthrough in drug manufacture. Meanwhile, Sally Ride has been preparing for her exercise with the robot arm in the shuttle's cargo hold. Her job is to release and later retrieve a reusable space pallet. Another of Challenger's cameras gave Mission Control views of a heavily overcast Earth. The space shuttle is orbiting upside down, and so this is the view that appears above the astronauts' heads.
For 2/3 the level on Earth in a test for future spacewalks. They performed well, one of the computers did not, but it was such a minor hitch it didn't even interrupt the flight plan. The only woman on board, Sally Ride, adjusted the cameras for a good close-up view of the Earth, and then did some exercises, joking that she was one of the few people to run across the Indian Ocean. Another astronaut showed how complicated their experiments could get.
The motor spot temp gets 110 degrees. He wants to go with a space pointing attitude. That will be a target of 2, body vector of +5, and it'll be a pitch of 0, yaw of 090, and omicron of 0, and we'll sit there for 15 minutes and then go to -CLD.
President Reagan some experiments and flight maneuvers, but there's also been time for less scientific activities. Jelly beans, a gift from the White House, figured prominently. President Reagan's favorite confection went down well with Frederick Houck, the shuttle's pilot. The first American woman in space, Sally Ride, proved an equally agile jelly bean eater. But there was serious business too. The astronauts tested a radar aerial that will track a package of experiments they'll release into space from the shuttle's payload bay tomorrow. And Sally Ride tested equipment that on future flights could be used to make drugs that can't be purified here on Earth.
Conducting a series of experiments which may eventually help in the treatment of hormone deficiency, but the 5 astronauts had time to enjoy themselves too.
For 7 hours, Sally Ride worked on Challenger's hormone refining experiment. Electrophoresis, separating cells from a liquid, produces medicines of a purity which can't be matched on Earth. Already there are plans for a space drug factory. There's been one minor snag today. A computer in the cargo hold was overheating, so Challenger turned round to keep it in shadow. Tomorrow the crew will put a cargo platform into space, something which should provide some spectacular views of Challenger herself. Meanwhile today, as the astronauts clocked up 1 million miles in orbit, they produced a bag of jelly beans, a present from the White House. Even in space, they go down well.
It's a little easier to make the catches here.
The space-age art of 3D pictures is on show at an exhibition in Bath. Produced by lasers, they're called holograms and look like real objects. Our science correspondent James Wilkinson's been looking at them.
Holograms are more than just three-dimensional pictures. As you change the angle at which you look at the picture itself changes. You can actually see round corners, as if you were looking at a solid object. It's the world's largest exhibition of holograms. There are more than 100 on show. Holography was invented in Britain over 30 years ago, but it's only now coming into its own. The objects may look three-dimensional, but in fact they're on pieces of glass just a few millimeters thick. As you walk past a hologram of a galaxy, it seems to be suspended in space. With others, the picture seems to stand out in front of the frame. The exhibition includes demonstrations of how holograms are made. It's all done with lasers. The object to be photographed is illuminated with a laser. The image of the object is captured on a large photographic plate. Holograms are increasingly used in industry. Several supermarkets in Britain now have checkout counters which use holography. The checkout girl passes the object over a special machine and it reads the barcode label at whatever angle it's presented. It's far quicker than conventional ways of shopping. Holograms are used by the advertising industry. Three-dimensional hoardings have an eye-catching appeal. They have a use too in security. Hologram identity badges are almost impossible to forge. They could be one answer to the video pirates. If it's got one of these badges on it, you can be sure it's an original cassette. Some holograms at the exhibition are particularly effective, producing an unreal and ethereal effect.
The threat to the televising of Wimbledon is over. In the past hour, the BBC and the technicians...
Its crew passed the halfway point of their 6-day mission. They were asked to point the cargo doors away from the sun to give some sensitive equipment a good cold soak before tomorrow's experiments. And they tested a radar aerial that will track those experiments when they're released into space on board a West German satellite tomorrow. As a step towards establishing commercial factories in space, Sally Ride tested a process for making complex drugs, which is much easier away from the Earth's gravity. And then the camera caught them eating a surprise snack smuggled on board by Commander Crippen.
Making a famous grab.
A bag of President Reagan's jelly beans, straight from the White House to tickle the astronauts' taste buds. The results of this experiment were not recorded by Mission Control.
The crew of the American Space Shuttle Challenger have successfully launched a satellite into space and then recaptured it. They've sent back some spectacular pictures. Newsround's space editor, Reg Turnell, is on the line now, I hope, from the Kennedy Space Center. Reg, it must have been a very tense time.
Yes, John, but the shuttle has now proved it can capture a damaged satellite and repair it. For 9 hours, we've been getting fabulous views of Challenger against Earth's background 300 kilometers below. This is the view from the TV cameras mounted on Germany's 2-ton Spars satellite. And from Challenger's cameras, we've been looking the other way at Spars. The two of them have been carrying out a sort of orbital ballet. But Sally Ride, who used the robot arm to place Spars in orbit, had to use it to grab Spa's back again earlier than expected because its robot brain got much too hot. But now it's cooled down and they've released it again.
Well, it must have been a very proud time as well for the German scientists, Reg.
Yes, indeed. Spa's was all their own idea, cost only £15 million, and will now be used commercially as the world's first mini space station.
Reg, thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye. Well, finally, on the Canadian tour, the
Space Shuttle Challenger has been experimenting to prove it can carry cargo in space.
Test number 2.
Yes, sir, we copied that.
Commander Bob Crippen controlled the arm, which sent out and retrieved a satellite 5 times. The West German-built satellite is free-flying and also functions as a laboratory. If it's returned successfully to Earth, it could revolutionize space technology.
As you can see, it's a very smooth operation coming in. The RMS very easily controllable, and the SPAS itself is a very stable platform.
Their mission, releasing a satellite into orbit and then recapturing it. It's the first time that's been done. A camera on board the satellite took these pictures, which for the first time shows the shuttle in orbit. That's Earth behind it. Although it doesn't look it, the shuttle is travelling at 17,000 miles an hour.
4.5 hours carrying a set of experiments. And it was able to take these pictures, the first ever taken of the shuttle from space. NASA say the shuttle may not be able to land in Florida on Friday because of bad weather, so you can't see it on this satellite picture. The shuttle may go instead to either New Mexico or California, or alternatively it may spend another 2 days in orbit. In this week's Science Roundup, how a third world country has managed to preserve its rainforests against the pressures of agriculture and tree felling. But first, an important day in the mission of the Space Shuttle Challenger.
Today's Challenger project is in many ways the most vital of all shuttle experiments to date. For the successful recovery of a satellite using a robot arm is the first step towards proving that shuttle can be used to repair satellites in space and even build space stations. The satellite the shuttle launched today carried 6 experiments, as well as the cameras that produced the first pictures of the shuttle in space. It flew free for 4.5 hours, a shorter flight than planned. But the robot arm passed this crucial test. Next year it will fly for real, grabbing a broken scientific satellite which blew a fuse, bringing it into the shuttle for repairs and releasing it again. Weather in Florida may be too bad for the Challenger to land there on Friday as planned. Diverting it to California to land is a small setback to long-term plans for the shuttle to take off and land from Cape Canaveral as regularly as a jumbo jet. Further proof that the Russians are developing a space shuttle of their own comes from pictures sent to ITN by the Australian Defence Department. They were taken by an Australian Air Force patrol shadowing a Russian recovery ship in the Indian Ocean 3 months ago. We reported exclusively at the time that the Russians had tested a mysterious winged spacecraft by sending it into a single orbit of the Earth and recovering it in the Indian Ocean. It was the second such test in a year. The large cones on the 15-foot-long model spaceplane are recovery beacons. On the deck of the Russian ship Chumikan, the heat tiles, like the American shuttles, are clearly visible, and the plane's up-tilted wings resemble America's very first design for a manned spacecraft over 20 years ago. Tropical rainforests are a rich, untapped natural resource. Tragically, almost
5 astronauts aboard the Space Shuttle Challenger have carried out the most spectacular maneuver of their mission. They released a satellite into orbit and then recaptured it. It's an operation which could prove very important for the future of space technology.
Sally Ride and John Fabian justified their places on Challenger today with a remarkable space first. Operating a 50-foot robot arm, they dropped a pallet loaded with experiments into orbit, then after several hours brought it back on board. The SPAS platform was built by West German engineers. It was floated out to a point where it was 1,000 feet above Challenger. Then a remote camera started beaming down the SPAS eye view of the shuttle.
That's beautiful.
180 miles above the clouds, Challenger's true speed of 17,500 miles an hour seemed no more than a gentle glide. The southern hemisphere was shrouded in dense cloud on this orbit, a reminder that Challenger sees summer and winter every 90 minutes. Then came the other first, retrieval of the spar's platform. This could have been a damaged satellite or a crippled spacecraft. It's underlined the true importance of the shuttle orbiter's role as a space truck, equally suitable for delivery or recovery.
The crew of the American Space Shuttle Challenger today launched a satellite into space from the cargo bay and then recovered it. It's the first time this has ever been done. It means future shuttles will be able to repair satellites in orbit or bring them back to Earth for servicing. This is how they did it.
When Mission Control suggested to astronaut Sally Ride that these pictures looked like an animation, Sally Ride from inside Challenger said, "Oh no, they don't. In fact, not only are they real, but they are the most remarkable shots ever taken of the shuttle in orbit. The first time the spaceship has been filmed by a camera not attached to it, and therefore the first time it has been seen in its entirety in space, and seen here orbiting the Earth at 18,000 miles an hour.
That's a beautiful shot.
The pictures came from this satellite built by West Germany and carrying several scientific experiments as well as that camera. The satellite is the shuttle's plaything. Using the mechanical arm, the astronauts put the satellite out into space, let it go, then latched onto it again, then let it go again. Then Sally Ride, operating the arm, closed in on the satellite, this time for the last time.
Looking out the overhead window to assist in all of the ranging as we get in closer. As you can see, it's a very smooth operation coming in. The RMS very easily controllable, and the SPAS itself is a very stable platform.
The satellite was brought back into the payload area, a perfect practice for the time when the shuttle will have to retrieve satellites in need of repair and put them back into space again.
We got all 5 of us up here today.
The crew might have an unexpected bonus in store, a longer flight than planned. The shuttle may be a marvelous spacecraft, but once it gets back into the Earth's atmosphere, with its engines cut, it is just a glider, with a glider's susceptibility to cloud, rain and crosswinds. And judging by the thickness of the cloud the astronauts could see today as they passed over Florida, the landing planned for Friday might well be delayed. John Suchet, News at 10 in the United States.
Evidence that the Russians are developing a space shuttle of their own comes from pictures sent to ITN by the Australian Department of Defence. They were taken by a Royal Australian Air Force patrol shadowing a Soviet recovery ship in the Indian Ocean 3 months ago. We reported exclusively at the time that the Russians had just tested a mysterious winged spacecraft, sending it into a single orbit of the Earth and recovering it in the Pacific Ocean. It was the second such test in a year. The large cones on the 15-foot-long model spaceplane are recovery beacons to help the ship find it when it splashed down. Once it was on the deck of the Russian ship Shumikan, the Australian pilots could clearly see the heat tiles similar to those on the American space shuttles. The plane's up-tilted wings resemble America's very first design for a manned spaceplane over 20 years ago.
As the Space Shuttle Challenger finished their final flight duties, the director announced the craft would land tomorrow as scheduled. There'd been fears it would have to stay in orbit for an extra day because of bad weather over the Kennedy Space Center. But that now seems to be clearing up for what will be NASA's first Florida landing. But if all fails, the shuttle can still go on for a landing in California tomorrow.
Havoc with the flight plan of America's Space Shuttle Challenger. Forecasts of storms at Kennedy Space Center caused Mission Control to postpone the shuttle's landing by a day until Saturday. But then the weather improved, and the astronauts were given a go-ahead to touchdown tomorrow on schedule. The astronauts have discovered a fault in a turbine in the landing system, but it's not thought to be serious. Prince Edward.
is due back to Earth tomorrow morning, in spite of reports that bad weather would delay its return. If a landing looks risky, the shuttle would go into one more orbit or touch down at Edwards Air Force Base in California. There'd been reports that the shuttle would stay up for an extra day, but there've been problems with one of the auxiliary power units, and Mission Control don't want to use up too much fuel. So, weather permitting, the craft should come down at Cape Canaveral just before noon tomorrow. But I'll be back at about 20 to 12 with the late summary. Until then, good night.
American Space Shuttle are preparing for touchdown about midday tomorrow at a runway near the launch site at Cape Kennedy in Florida. It'll be the first time any shuttle has attempted a landing there. Thunderstorms that could have delayed the landing show signs of clearing. If they don't, the crew will divert to Edwards Air Force Base in California 3 hours later. One of their last jobs today was to see how the giant robot arm for catching satellites stood up to maneuvering in space, and they seem to have cured faults in one of the 3 auxiliary power units.
A couple of due to land at Cape Canaveral in a few hours' time, despite earlier indications that the landing might be postponed. If weather permits, it'll be the first time a shuttle has landed at its home base. There's been some technical difficulty for the astronauts on the last part of their mission, as Robert Bazell of NBC News now reports.
There was one problem. A power unit important to the landing failed a test. There are 2 spare units, but NASA officials decided that because of the failure, the shuttle should land. That creates a problem because the weather at the Kennedy Space Center, the prime landing site, has not been good. Forecasters say there is a good chance it will improve, but if it doesn't, the shuttle will land at Edwards Air Force Base in California, where conditions have been good. If the Challenger does come down in Florida, in parts of Texas, Louisiana, and Florida, it will be visible as a speck moving quickly across the sky. The trip will end on the 3-mile-long concrete runway cut through the Florida swamp.
Forced another 90-minute delay in the landing of the American Space Shuttle. It's not due down now until mid-afternoon. And there's been a further delay in the return of the American Space Shuttle Challenger. It was to have landed in a few minutes' time at Cape Canaveral in Florida. But just over an hour ago, the plans were changed because of bad weather there. Instead, it's due down just before 3 o'clock this afternoon, our time, at the Edwards Air Force Base in California. Here's our science correspondent, James Wilkinson.
So the 7th shuttle mission, which has gone perfectly so far, will end with disappointment. Instead of landing, as everyone hoped, at Cape Canaveral, where it began its journey last Saturday, it will go round for an extra orbit and land instead at Edwards Air Force Base in California, where most of the previous missions have ended. The decision to switch the landing to California was made just over an hour ago. There had been early morning patchy fog at the Cape and scattered cloud at 5,000 feet. The clouds weren't so much of a worry as the fog. When John Young went up in a jet training aircraft to assess the weather, he decided a landing was not on. The last-minute change of landing site demonstrates one of the vulnerabilities of the shuttle. It's not the first time that the landing site has had to be switched at the last minute. The shuttle managers are trying to aim for a quick turnaround of the shuttle so it can be made ready for its next flight as quickly as possible. Landing in California means they'll have to jack the shuttle up onto a Boeing 747 and fly it back to Florida. This all takes time, and with the shuttle so much in demand to launch commercial satellites, it's time they can ill afford. But the weather in Florida gave them no alternative. Mission controllers had hoped that the sun would burn the fog away, but it didn't happen.
Another space first.
During the last moments in space, there was some fun and games involving the space doctor, Norman Thagard. But the doctor does have a serious role too, studying any signs of space sickness on his 4 fellow astronauts. So far, there's been little information on how those researches have gone. But despite today's disappointment, the mission has been a spectacular success. Which is this time?
For main engine start, we have main engine start, and the ignition, and liftoff. Liftoff of STS-7 and America's first woman astronaut. And the shuttle has cleared the tower.
It was Challenger's second ride into space. Last time, the mission wasn't particularly successful. The big communication satellite it launched didn't go into the correct orbit. This time, there were no such problems. It was Sally Ride's job to release the first of Challenger's 2 satellites. It was a Canadian communication satellite. Spinning slowly, it drifted away. Drifted away. A present from the White House went with them. The remote-controlled arm grasped an experimental package from the cargo bay and released it. It floated up to 1,000 feet away and pointed its cameras at Challenger. It sent back spectacular pictures of the shuttle gliding along at 17,000 miles an hour. Unusually, the crew kept remarkably well. No sign of space sickness. This time, it had marred previous flights. Then another first. The remote-controlled arm docked with the satellite it had just deployed and brought it back. In future, satellites will be mended like this, saving millions of pounds, all part of the drive to make space pay. And the latest is that the shuttle is still due to land at the Edwards Air Force.
Well, we shall be returning to that match on the centre court quite shortly. Now, as I explained to you earlier, there's been a delay in the return of the Space Shuttle because of bad weather in California, but it is due to touchdown at the Edwards Air Force Base very shortly. And I understand we can go live in vision now to California. And our man this end, in our new studio here, will be James Wilkinson.
Just about an hour ago, the Challenger fired its engines to begin the deorbiting maneuver. Then, at about 2:30, it began its re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere. And we had the usual communications blackout. That lasted for about 16 minutes. And then, a short while ago, Challenger was picked up by television cameras on high-flying aircraft. It flew over the coast about 50 miles north of Los Angeles, over Palmdale, and then executed a 250-degree left turn. There are, of course, 5 astronauts on board. 4 of them are in the flight deck looking out of the windows, and one of them is, in fact, below them in the middeck, where, of course, he can't see anything. It's landing on the dry lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base, not the concrete runway as it has landed on before. And the reason for this is that they're anxious to land in a crosswind, so they can see how the shuttle behaves in these sort of conditions.
Range 23 miles.
They've been trying to get this crosswind information on the last 5 missions, but have so far failed. So although it's disappointing that it won't land at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, they will at least get the crosswind information they've wanted so badly. 3 or 4 minutes ago, those waiting at the landing strip will have heard an enormously loud bang
directly from the south at 10 knots.
As the shockwave from the shuttles breaking the sound barrier reached them. But of course it's slowed right down now, coming in at a very steep angle. Looking steeper there because it's executing the turn.
55 knots, altitude 34,000 feet. Touching the hack now. 18 miles to touchdown.
It isn't an automatic landing. The commander, Bob Crippen, will take over the controls.
30,000 feet at 257 knots.
We'll take over the controls for the final 5,000 feet.
Beginning the wide sweeping left turn around the hack.
They haven't done a completely automatic landing yet, although the shuttle is capable of it. On this particular landing, of course, they want to get the crosswind information, so they are retaining control over the last stages as it comes in to the lake bed at Edwards Air Force Base.
$20,000 feet. 258 knots. Challenger turning final now.
Just
Right
a
on
few
the
minutes away from touchdown.
Flight Dynamics Officer Willis Bolt reports. On glide slope and turning toward the center line. 14,000 feet. 292 knots.
Your energy looks good. Surface wind 180 at 10.
Just a minute or so away now from touchdown. As it gets to about 2,000 feet, it will begin the flare maneuver.
282 knots. On glide slope on center line.
So all looks set for a pinpoint landing as usual. Coming down much more steeply than an ordinary conventional aeroplane.
281 knots.
No sign there of the two chase aircraft which normally go up and accompany it down, spotting, looking at making last-minute checks to make sure everything's all right.
2,900 feet. 287 knots.
Just about to begin the flare maneuver. There it goes. And there come the wheels, very close to the landing strip. And it's down. Kicking up sand and dust. That's quite a nuisance for them, of course, because it usually causes odd nicks and scratches in the delicate heat-resistant tiles on the belly of the shuttle. And those, of course, have to be repaired before it can go into space again.
And Challenger's back home, back to Earth. The unofficial touchdown time, in mission elapsed time, 6 days, 2 hours, 24 minutes, 10 seconds. That time is unofficial.
And the convoy of landing vehicles will now be moving out to meet Challenger as it rolls to a halt. Their job will be to make it safe. The first thing they'll do will be to test to see whether there are any toxic fumes from the engines, and if there are, they'll blow them away with a large wind machine they've got there. Then they'll attach various tubes and pipes to the shuttle and purge it with air to get rid of all the fumes that are inside it in the cargo bay.
Roger, we see that. Congratulations, a great-looking landing. And from the entry team, got some good news. Good news is the beer is very, very cold this morning. The bad news is it's 3,000 miles away.
That's what I was afraid of.
And I'll hand you over to the good guy Gardner here, and he'll talk to you about your post-landing.
Roger that. And Challenger, we're going to go.
So with that smooth landing, albeit in the wrong place, the 7th shuttle mission comes to an end. Probably the most successful mission they've had so far. The 5 astronauts on board no doubt breathing a sigh of relief at being back on the ground again. And of course there'll be some celebrating tonight in the Sally Ride household. She's married to an astronaut. There'll be a lot of interest in her when she emerges from the Challenger in about half an hour or so. We'll be back with an up-to-minute report in our news at 5:40. So, with the Challenger safely down, we go from the sun-baked Mojave Desert in California to the rather lusher greenery at Wimbledon and Harry Carpenter.
Thanks very much. Not quite sun-baked here, but we're hoping.
On BBC One First, News Round Extra with John Craven.
2,900 feet.
Hello again, and tonight on News Round Extra, the safe return of the Space Shuttle Challenger. It touched down in America this afternoon after a mission that lasted exactly 6 days, 2 hours, 24 minutes and 10 seconds. But Challenger didn't go straight home. Thunderstorms and high winds at the Kennedy Space Center in Florida stopped that happening. Instead, it landed 3,000 miles away in California. So the celebrations planned at Kennedy for the 5 astronauts, including Sally Ride, the first American woman in space, will have to wait for a while. And the new runway at Kennedy, specially built for shuttle landings, will also have to wait for another mission before it welcomes home its first spaceship. Our space editor, Reg Turnhill, who's been covering the flight of Challenger for Newsround, will be on the line from America very soon with the latest news. Challenger blasted off from Kennedy last Saturday, and the bosses of America's space team waited until late this morning before deciding that, weather-wise, it was too risky for the shuttle to go back there. So the astronauts headed instead for Edwards Air Force Base on the desert sands of California.
Challenger turning final now.
But NASA made good use of the change of plans. They've always wanted to know how the shuttle would behave when it landed in a crosswind. That's when the wind blows sideways onto the spacecraft. There was a crosswind at Edwards, and the shuttle still made a perfect landing.
Turning toward the center line. 14,000 feet. 292 knots.
We're away to come to California.
Roger that.
Gears coming.
Despite the change of landing site, the astronauts were happy with the way the mission had gone, and Mission Control was obviously delighted too.
Roger, we see that. Congratulations, a great-looking landing.
There were various routine checks, and 40 minutes after landing, the 5 astronauts emerged into the sunshine. The first task was to walk round the spacecraft to inspect it before they could head off for their big welcome home. Well, on the line now, I hope, is our space editor, Reg Turnhill. Reg, I suppose everybody really is very pleased with the way things have gone.
Yes, John, there's a news conference going on here now, and the head of the shuttle program has just described it as a superb mission, with Germany's STS satellite representing a whole new approach to the design of future spacecraft. And they're planning to take it up again early next year for a full rehearsal of repairing damaged spacecraft in orbit. And Sally Ride's flight was described as the first milestone for women astronauts. The second milestone will be when nobody notices when women fly because they're doing the same professional job as men.
But all of you there, Reg, at Kennedy must have been very disappointed that the shuttle didn't land with you.
Oh, terribly disappointed. 4,000 of us had a long, wasted night fighting off the mosquitoes. Those empty stands were filled by a great fleet of chartered buses. 2,000 newsmen and 2,000 VIPs were taken out to the edge of the runway, led by Maureen Reagan, the president's daughter, who wanted to be first to congratulate Sally Ride. Mind you, we were never very hopeful. There have been thunderstorms around the Cape all the week, with the 5-kilometer runway often hidden in fog.
Well, Reg, when do you think a shuttle will land at Kennedy?
Well, not until next year now. Perhaps the 11th shuttle flight in January. That's because the next flight by Challenger in August is a night landing which must be in the desert for safety reasons. Then in October, when the shuttle flies Europe's Space Log, that's so heavy that that too must be landed in the desert in case it overshoots. But there's little doubt, John, that by the middle of next year, the astronauts will be putting on their maneuvering units and flying off without tethers to do their first space repair on a broken-down solar maximum satellite that's supposed to be studying the sun.
Well, Reg, we'll look forward to that, and thank you very much indeed for your reports. Well, obviously disappointment at the Cape, but good news at least that Challenger has had such a successful return to Earth. Well, Reg Turnell has been doing a lot of travelling for Newsround Extra. Just a few weeks ago, one of the other space shuttles, Enterprise, was flown on a tour of Europe, and Reg caught up with it at the Paris Air Show. He went there to find out about the future plans for the shuttle programme.
The tour was to show that the space shuttles, 3 of them by the end of this year, are now operational. Satellites are already big business, and the shuttles will launch them for anybody at about £10 million each. Rockwell, who make the shuttles, also want to use them to build big space stations in orbit, as their shuttle manager, Dr. Rocco Petrone, told me.
We're looking forward to the present Space Lab staying up some 21 days, and then possibly the second step, some 45 days, leading to the development of modules which then can be assembled by the orbiter, and one could envision a space station of various sizes. I think the first sizes will be modest, but we talk of a crew of some 6 to 12 people that could perform experiments in that space station and given us the requirements we need, literally, to keep developing. Many ways the size is literally unlimited, and only the future will tell what that size will be.
One of Sally Ride's jobs was to practice making very pure medicines in weightless conditions. Tests on the first 7 flights have given hope that cures can be found for illnesses like leukemia and diabetes.
We plan on being able to develop new materials, new pharmaceuticals, drugs which can be used, we think, to cure some sicknesses on Earth that cannot be treated today. I really feel with a laboratory such as we can build in 0G, in which man has really never lived for any lengthy period of time, out of that laboratory will come many new things for benefits here on Earth, new products, hopefully new medicines, and I think the future is literally only bound by our mind and not bound by our tools once we step into space.
The space shuttle is operational now, and in future all the launches and landings should look much the same, unless of course anything goes wrong. So what's important is the work the shuttle's doing while in orbit. One of the astronauts at the Paris Air Show was Don Peterson, who spent 4 hours spacewalking on the 6th shuttle flight. He told me that these EVAs, or extravehicular activities, will soon become a routine but vital part of life in space.
Basic idea of the EVA is to do a couple of 3 things. One is to grab a satellite that's already on orbit, bring it in close to the bay, put people outside and repair or service it as necessary. Another is to work on the orbit itself, and we basically, all our crews train for contingency situations, should the orbiter need to have its doors closed or some piece of equipment tied down or cut loose. And I guess finally, we are developing a backpack in which a human being can in effect become a small spacecraft and go from one vehicle to another for resupply or simply to transfer people.
Ariane, Europe's own rocket, can launch satellites more cheaply, so it's providing the shuttle with some fierce international competition. But Ariane, of course, can't be reused like the shuttle, and Dr. Petrone has no doubts about the exciting future ahead.
I think up to the year 2000, with the tools we now have, with those that will be developed to be placed.
Mission accomplished. Shuttle makes a desert landing and a space revolution. The little girl hit by a police bullet in her school playground. Coach crash on the M5, 3 dead, 21 injured. Yasser Arafat on the road from Damascus. The Syrians kick him out. And Chris Lloyd goes out of Wimbledon in the 3rd round. Good evening. The Space Shuttle Challenger is safely home, and it's chalked up a spectacular number of space firsts. The shuttle made a faultless touchdown, although it was 3,000 miles away from the planned landing site. It had been diverted because of bad weather at Cape Canaveral, but mission control still say this is the most successful flight of the whole shuttle program. On board Challenger was America's first woman astronaut. But as our science correspondent James Wilkinson reports, that wasn't the only breakthrough of this mission.
The weather at Cape Canaveral may have closed in, but there were no visibility problems here in California. After banking sharply, Challenger glided in for its final approach to the dry lake bed at the Edwards Air Force Base in the Mojave Desert. Bob Crippen at the controls has flown this route before. He's become the first man to make 2 flights in the shuttle. The dust is unwelcome. It rubs the shuttle's underbelly like sandpaper. The scratches will have to be repaired before the next flight. The landing had been thirsty work.
Congratulations, a great looking landing. Good news is the beer is very, very cold this morning. The bad news is it's 3,000 miles away.
That's what I was afraid of.
It had been the most successful mission so far. The astronauts will feel well pleased when they look back on their flight. Sally Ride was in charge of Challenger's first job, the launch of the Canadian communications satellite. It underlined what the shuttle program is all about, making space pay. At the moment at least, it's cheaper to launch satellites this way rather than with conventional rockets.
We deliver. Okay.
The big test came when the robot arm was used to deploy an experimental package. It's the first time the arm has released a satellite in this way. It drifted up to 1,000 feet from the shuttle. Later, the arm retrieved it and pulled it back into the cargo bay. In future, damaged satellites will be captured this way to be repaired. Cameras on board the mini-satellite sent back spectacular pictures of the shuttle, drifting along at a mere 17,000 miles an hour. The first time the shuttle has been photographed like this. After the landing today, the 5 astronauts, including America's first woman astronaut, emerged looking remarkably relaxed. It wasn't the usual style homecoming. The official welcoming party was on the other side of the continent. But at least President Reagan managed to speak to them.
Welcome home. Thank you very much, sir. And now this is the second time. You know, I was going to meet you in Florida, but then you decided to land in California. But again, you didn't stop and pick me up off the South Lawn like I asked you to.
I'm guilty, sir.
There was a especially warm welcome from the crowd for Sally Ride.
It was fun, and in fact, I'm sure it's the most fun I'll ever have in my life.
Challenger will now have to be ferried back to Cape Canaveral on top of a Boeing 747, and that could delay the next scheduled launch in August by up to a week.
An 8-year-old...
The Space Shuttle Challenger had a perfect landing in the California desert today, not where the Americans really wanted it, but America is set to step up its journeys into space. 5 more flights are planned over the next 10 months, including one to bring back a satellite that's been in Earth orbit for more than 2 years. America's first woman astronaut, Sally Ride, said it was the highlight of her life. When President Reagan telephoned to say welcome back, he told her, "You were there because you were the best person for the job."
It has been, by general consent, the most successful shuttle mission to date, right down to these final stages, with first a steep dive, followed by a sharp bank on the approach to the runway, all without engines and all going perfectly. The weather, though, is not under NASA's control, and since Florida was thick with cloud, the shuttle once again landed on the dried lake bed in California. Not the concrete runway in Florida, but the dust of the California desert. The change of landing site has meant major adjustments, including the plan to quench the crew's thirst.
Congratulations, a great looking landing. And from the entry team, got some good news. Good news is the beer is very, very cold this morning. The bad news is it's 3,000 miles away.
The landing was so accurate it might as well have been on the narrow runway in Florida. As for the success of the mission, NASA will remember it for the fact that 2 satellites were put into space, earning NASA nearly $17 million in fees, but the world will remember it for Sally Ride, America's first woman in space.
The thing that I'll remember most about that flight is that it was fun, and in fact, I'm sure it's the most fun I'll ever have in my life.
President Reagan was to have been in Florida, but a phone call to California did nearly as well.
Welcome home. You were there because you were the best person for the job. And I think that sets a standard that's going to be followed for men and women in the force from now on with these experiments. People are picked neither because of nor in spite of, but simply because, like all 5 of you, you were the best for this assignment.
As for the future, this flight has shown that an object can be plucked out of space, essential for the future repair of satellites. Space can become, in fact, a workshop. John Suchet, News at 10 in the United States.
Salyut 7. The last Soyuz flight, with 3 cosmonauts on board, failed to link up with Salyut. What went wrong has never been explained. And let's hope the Russians don't have the same problems which the Americans had on their latest shuttle flight. It landed on the right day, but in the wrong place, in California, instead of its launch site in Florida. Newsround's space editor, Reg Turnell, has sent us this exclusive report on why the shuttle had to land last Friday.
The main reason why Shuttle Challenger had to land in the Californian desert on Friday and not wait as planned for perfect weather here at the Cape on Saturday was that once again the toilet broke down.
Congratulations.
Officially, Challenger was brought home because of a faulty fuel cell. But I've learned that the toilet, hidden behind a curtain on the lower deck, where the 5 astronauts, including Sally Ride, had to cook, eat and sleep, failed halfway through the 6-day mission. It works with a pump and fan, and it's gone wrong on several previous flights. Now that the crew has increased from 2 to 5, the atmosphere must have got very unpleasant. It's amazing.
A space anniversary. Telstar, the first transatlantic television satellite, did its stuff first 21 years ago today. It was the beginning of a revolution.
A summer's night 21 years ago, engineers at Goonhilly Down waited impatiently for the first transatlantic pictures from Telstar. With them was ITN reporter Ian Trethowan.
Well, so far the operation's gone almost exactly as planned. Telstar is safely in orbit. We've now reached the exciting position that we're waiting for fresh computed information from America before making the crucial decision of exactly when to start trying to take the first television pictures from America through Telstar down here to Goonhilly.
Telstar was launched earlier that day from Cape Canaveral. It was ready to go by midnight, but there were technical hitches at Goonhilly. Finally, the pictures came through at 1 a.m.
This is the face. Bouncing around, but you can see absolutely clearly this is a...